Today we'll be looking at food services in childcare settings and school services. So the learning objectives of today are for you to actually understand the different types of care that are available within childcare centres, to understand the different legislative requirements for childcare centres and for schools. So as you've learnt throughout the course, your vulnerable populations include young children. So childcare centres are subject to quite a bit of legislation. Understand different food hygiene regulations around child and adolescent services. Understand the need for and be able to develop a nutrition policy and a menu. Consider and discuss ways of implementing a nutrition policy and menu. And be familiar with the NHMRC guidelines for children and adolescents as well. So what does childcare actually look like? So you've got long day care. So that might be facilities that open up at sort of 6:30 in the morning and close at 6:30 in the afternoon. So typical childcare centres like Good Start and so on will provide 12 hours worth of service. You've then got family daycare centres. So they might be in a house next door to you, for example, and they might have maybe 4 or 5 children there at a time, and that would be it. That compares to the long daycare centre where you might have 100 children. So in the online childcare site that you could follow through online and that field trip online, that childcare centre accounted for sort of around 100 children. So that gives you an idea of the size of those centres compared to a family daycare. You also have outside school hours care, which is often just the long day care centres, accepting children before and after for those parents that work longer than school hours. Primary schools, so within our primary schools, obviously we provide tuck shops and canteens, and hopefully you would be aware of the Better Choice program, but we will talk about that moving forward. Secondary schools as well, and within secondary schools we also talk about boarding houses, because a lot of the private high schools will have a boarding house attached to them also. Something to be aware of, I suppose, is that with your long day care and your family day care and your outside school hours care, parents are able to get what's called childcare benefit or a childcare rebate, or both, and they will provide somewhere between 50% up to around 80% of childcare fees. So long daycares will often cost around $100 a day, just to give you a really ballpark number, but parents will get about 50% of that back. So a working family will end up paying about $50 a day for their child to go to childcare. So this is just a bit of a quick summary for you in terms of hours. So that long day care there, it's listed 7:30 till 6, but for example, Good Start across the road here at Griffith is 6:30 till 6:30. They take children from around 6 weeks of age through to 6 years, and obviously then they go on to school. Often run by private companies, sometimes governments, sometimes they're not-for-profit organisations. There's a wide range of people that might run a long daycare centre. As I said, you've got those two rebates there, the benefit and the rebate. Some places will do food, so some long daycare centres will do breakfast, lunch, morning tea and afternoon tea. Some centres won't provide any food at all, and it will be completely up to the parent to actually provide that food. Some centres will just provide morning tea and afternoon tea, so it is variable depending on the childcare centre that you're looking at. In the family daycare, often family daycares might even look after your child overnight if needed, often during the day, sometimes before and after school care as well. Usually they're individuals, so they're not big companies, they're not government run. It might be someone who's been working in childcare for 10 years. They got sick of leaving their house to go to work, so they decided that they would actually open up a small childcare centre inside their own home. So if you think about it from a business perspective, if those children are paying about $100 a day and they look after 4 children, that person is then earning $400 a day minus their costs, which would be things like food and so on. So it can be quite a good alternative compared to childcare centres for the self-employed worker. And again, the benefits and the rebates are available in the Family Daycare Centre. So outside of school hours care, obviously that's before and after school. Often is the childcare centre just accepting more children. Again, for that you might pay maybe $20 and you'll get $10 back from the government or thereabouts. Sometimes they include afternoon tea and sometimes they don't. And obviously the primary and secondary schools, we have government schools for that, and parents send food to school with their children, or the children can get food from their tuck shop or canteen. Obviously you can also go to private primary schools and secondary schools, but it's usually the same thing. The parents will send that food in. In boarding houses, that food will be completely provided to the students. So what is the food legislation that governs childcare centres and schools? We've talked about the Food Act. So the Food Act is very important within these two areas. There's also a food regulation in 2006, so that comes in underneath the Act. So that acts as a, provides a little bit more detail compared to the Food Act. You've got the Australian New Zealand Food Standard Codes, which is further legislation, focusing more on food safety and hygiene. And that's where you find that, that standard 3.3.1, where we talked about vulnerable persons, where young children, the aged, etc., fall into that category. You then have the Food Production Act as well of 2000, and that looks at things like primary produce, goes a little bit outside of where the other regulations, acts and codes have talked about, and moves more into that, as I said, primary produce. So childcare centres, they are governed by what's called a National Quality Framework for Approved Childcare. They have various standards that come under there, and they have healthy eating guidelines and so on. So within this particular framework, you've got standard 2.2, and we talk about healthy eating is promoted and food and drinks provided by the service are nutritious and appropriate for each child. So the key there is appropriate. So the service then, that might be a bit of a guideline for them, but then they need more specific information about the different ages and what is appropriate within those age groups going forward. So in terms of within Queensland do have a healthy eating guideline for childcare centres, and I'll just quickly go through those 10 guidelines now. So the first guideline is exclusive breastfeeding up until the age of 6 months, and the childcare centre should be supporting that, that guideline. Continued breastfeeding is recommended up to 12 months and longer if the mother and the baby wish. So a childcare centre might facilitate that by allowing the mother to come in and feed their baby throughout the day if she works nearby. So for example, if a childcare centre is based at, let's say we had one here at Griffith University, then a mother might be able to go through to the childcare centre and feed their child up until probably the age of 12 months. Most childcare centres probably wouldn't care if the mother kept coming up to 2 years, but it's just something that is a guideline under Queensland. So healthy eating guideline number 2, it's also around that feeding up to 6 months, but for infants that aren't breastfed, they should really be using infant formula. So all the way up until 12 months. So milk really shouldn't be introduced until 12 months of age. At 12 months, babies can start having full cream milk, and then from 2 years they can have low-fat milk, and from 5 years of age they can have skim milk. So that's what that guideline is for. It's limiting water, juices, milks, etc. Water can be consumed from the age of 6 months, but we're talking about 60 ml a day between the ages of 6 and 12 months. So a lot of childcare centres won't actually provide that to the child, because the child's probably getting 60 ml of water just at home with their parents. So they may not, but it's important that there's that communication between the centre and home. Healthy eating guideline number 3 is to introduce suitable solids at around 6 months of age. So the World Health Guideline says around 6 months. A lot of people do say 4 months, but actually that's outdated information now, and it's actually 6 months of age. So we childcare centres really need to be following those guidelines and not providing food until that particular point in time. Now it does say suitable solids there, so I guess these days there's two schools of thought around what is suitable. Some families really go for traditional weaning, which is where you blend up the food and you feed the child. Some families go for baby-led weaning, where the child just gets food and they learn to chew and swallow. So it doesn't really, there's no difference in terms of choking hazard or anything between the two types of feeding. It's just that you can't combine the two, because if a child is learning to swallow through pureed foods, and then you provide them with solid food and they try to swallow without chewing, then they're going to choke. But if a child learns how to chew and then swallow, then that's fine. But you just can't combine the two. The baby might get confused, and so you just need to stick to one. Now, some childcare centres will actually require parents to sign a waiver almost to say that baby-led weaning is okay for their child, and that's fine. So healthy eating guideline number 4 is making sure that children are given food in an appropriate setting. So eating should be fun, it should be enjoyable, and they should be getting a wide, nutritious range of food. So it's really just making sure that children are exposed to lots of different textures, and it's healthy and it's good for them in a happy setting. Okay, it shouldn't be a stressful environment. Healthy eating guideline number 5, I've sort of touched on this already, is that water. So provide water in addition to age-appropriate milk. So over 6 months, as I said, they can be getting water, but I know, for example, the child care centre that my child goes to, they don't give water unless I tell them to. So that's something that would be coordinated between the parent and the childcare centre. Guideline 6, sorry, I just discussed that, is should be positive, relaxed and social. Guideline 7 is having different foods. Guideline 8, an appropriate amount of food, but allow children to decide for themselves how much they should actually eat. And the next slide that we're going to is what's called Ellen Satter's division of responsibility. And that really makes that really clear that children should be allowed to decide how much they consume. They know whether they're full, they know whether they're hungry, they know what their stomach is telling them a lot better than what the childcare service does. So you let the child decide. Number 9 is to have meals and snacks at regular and predictable intervals. So they'll have morning tea, lunch, afternoon tea. That's pretty standard. And then 10, make sure the food is safely prepared. So you've talked about HACCP guidelines back in food science in second semester of second year. That also applies in a childcare facility. You need to make sure that food is refrigerated appropriately, that comes in from the parents, and any morning tea or afternoon tea or lunches, if you cook it at the childcare facility, that there's a food safety program, and that HACCP has, those critical control points have been identified and accounted for. So this is Ellen Satter's division of responsibility in feeding. I think it's actually a really important resource that we can use if we are providing education to a childcare facility. So parents decide basically what, when and where, and that works with the childcare centre as well. So the parents decide what's in the lunchbox, when to provide the food and so on. But a child is actually the one that's in charge of what they will eat, how much they will eat, and so on. So that's an excellent resource that actually not many childcare centres have that resource. So if you do get some work going into a childcare centre and providing an education, that is an excellent thing. And she has lots of resources that you can go and you can look up. So other resources include the Get Up and Grow Healthy Eating and Physical Activity for Early Childcare. In New South Wales, they have Good Food for Kids as well. Of course, we don't like to keep, redoing the same resources. So you can use other states' resources if it is appropriate for your setting. So why do we have a nutrition policy and a menu plan? It's about teaching children healthy eating. Having said that, they should be able to eat a wide range of foods. It doesn't have to be, fruit, vegetable, it's not that sort of clean eating sort of image. It can be a wide range of foods, but just in healthy volumes. Promote good nutrition. provide adequate nutrition whilst in care, so they need to be getting enough food, encourage lifelong eating habits. They need to meet accreditation standards and requirements, so they will get audited by the government. People will come in and have a look at their childcare centre, so they need to make sure that they are meeting appropriate nutrition standards. Identify strategies needed to deliver quality nutritional care. So a policy will be done, I'll show you in the next page on how to develop a nutrition policy, but it's a team get together and make that policy to ensure that the children are getting high quality nutrition care. It provides clear guidelines for staff as well. So examples of things that can happen. Children under 12 months really aren't supposed to consume salt, for example. However, if the policy doesn't discuss that, then potentially these childcare workers may not know that, you know, this child shouldn't get a rice cracker with, you know, the salty topping on it, or they might give them Vegemite, you know, sandwiches or something like that. So it's important to have things like that written into policies so that a staff member can refer to something and not make an error. It doesn't necessarily require the staff member having to go and look up heaps of different guidelines to try to work out what they can and cannot feed a child, and depending on what age they are. Centres are able to assess their performance and identify areas which need improvement. So if they have an excellent policy, you can then do a gap analysis. So you can look at the policy and the different strategies that you have written down, your ideal version. Then you can look at what you're actually providing. And then in a third column, I suppose, you discuss what is the difference between what you're providing and what the policy says you should be providing. And then from there, you can make improvements to the service. So if you were to do a review of a childcare centre, that might be an approach that you would take, is comparing what you want, what you actually have, and what you need to add into what you deliver in order to meet your recommendations. It means that parents will have greater confidence in the childcare centre, and to familiarise new staff and parents with operating nutrition strategies as well. So, for example, at Good Start, you walk in and before you've even walked into the centre, you've got the menu on the wall for people to have a look at. So it helps parents know what their child is getting when they're actually at the childcare centre. So this is a how to develop a food and nutrition policy, and I'll go through this in a little bit of detail because I actually think it's important, and it's an area where if you end up working in private practice after graduation, it'll be something that you can, a skill that you can market to childcare centres to go in and help them. Okay, so the first thing you're going to have to do is form a working party. You don't want to be doing it by yourself because you are not necessarily the expert on those particular children in that particular centre. So you're going to form a working party of staff who are at the centre and parents of the children at the centre. So you can work yourself and those two groups to form a working party and complete a nutrition policy. You would inform the centre's community. So the fact that you're working on redoing a policy or assessing an old policy and updating it, or you might be creating a new one from scratch if the childcare centre doesn't have one, you would want to let the centre know so that you can get feedback and any suggestions from any of the parents within the community. Identify what is already happening in food and nutrition. So that's what I was sort of saying in terms of looking at what you're delivering versus what the goal is. Ask the centre community. So now, as I said, you've informed them. You can then also ask for input. So different childcare centres will have different ways of communicating with staff. So they might send a newsletter home with the child. They might have an app where they upload different bits and pieces. Any of those things can mean that a parent can fill in a survey or a questionnaire, or maybe they'll run a focus group within the childcare centre of the parents to sort of get that feedback. They might have a parents' night for parents to come in and you can all have a bit of a chat and collect that information from everyone at once. Up to you on how you might run something like that. As a group, you would then draft a policy, and then you would distribute it and try to get feedback from the different groups. So you would send it out to the whole community, the centre directors, the staff, the parents, and try to get feedback from, on that. Then comes implementation. So you would implement it, and when you're implementing it, you would need to work out how that policy fits within the actual kitchen itself and what actually needs to happen on the ground. So you'd be looking at, do you need to buy new equipment, for example, for the new nutrition policy? Do you need to renovate the kitchen at all? How are you going to deliver things? What's the timing? How many cooks do you need cooking food? What type of recipes? Have you got standardized recipes? All of those things are embedded into that implementation. And of course, then you need to monitor and review it. So you might sort of, for example, every 6 or 12 months, go back, have a look at the nutrition policy compared to what's being delivered, and then try to either update the nutrition policy or update practices within the centre. So I hope that makes sense on how to develop a food and nutrition policy. So in terms of drafting a policy, so I guess what does a policy even look like? It's one thing for me to tell you that you need to draft a policy, but what are you going to include within that policy? So this is it here. So what needs to be considered? So your policy structure will include a rationale, goals and objectives and the strategies that you want. You'll discuss healthy food and drinks. So what, when, how much, etc. Now, how much is how much you are providing, not necessarily how much the child is consuming, because as I said, that's up to them. How is it safe? So looking at, looking at your food safety program, and there are food safety program tools for childcare centres, similar to aged care for private hospitals and so on. Social aspects, so you'll be looking at how the children are eating. Are they all sitting around a table? Are they, the young ones, making sure that they're sitting in high chairs? How many high chairs are there? Are they all sitting together? Are they in a circle or facing each other with the staff in the middle helping? How does it actually look in practice? What are you doing in terms of learning about food? So are the children involved in any of the food preparation or awareness activities, or what are the children learning and strategies that you can embed around mealtime to help children learn? You'll discuss partnerships with families, and within your policy you may have a method of families being able to provide feedback to the childcare centre regarding the policy. You would talk about staff development. Now, childcare workers, they come in, they have so many activities in order to entertain young children. They have activities that are designed to help children to learn different skills around fine motor skills, gross motor skills, coordination, all sorts of different things. So this is another thing that they have to know that potentially they haven't learned in their sort of certificate, their childcare certificate. So you want to make sure that your staff are trained and that you continue to develop their learning as well, because these are educated people who do want to learn. So take advantage of that, I suppose. And your method of evaluation should be in your policy as well, and frequency of evaluation. So I've touched on safe food, how to store, prepare, cook and serve. And as I said, we do have a food safety program, like the tool for development, similar to the private hospital tool that you have. It looks very similar. I have uploaded that onto Learning at Griffith. So have a quick flip through there. I'm not going to assess you individually on those items, because I think if you already are aware of the one for private hospitals, going forward in your career, you should be able to take that knowledge and apply it to the different settings. So once you're familiar with one, hopefully that will guide you with everything else. So it's just to make sure that you're aware that that tool does exist for childcare facilities. So here is an example of a nutrition policy. Now this is available in its sort of fullness on Learning at Griffith for you. You can see on this policy that they've referred to the National Quality Framework. They then have a policy statement underneath there, and then different strategies for policy implementation as well. And you can see they have quite a number of like they've got the heading there in terms of training and professional development, and then they've got different dot points underneath that will help with implementation and so on. So that covers childcare centres, and now we need to think about what about schools. So if you'd like to have a bit of a break, you can pause here and you can come back into the video. I think we're around 27.5 minutes. So feel free to take a break and come back in a moment. So what about schools? As we've discussed, or as I mentioned earlier, there are the Smart Choices legislation that we have here in Queensland. So that's mandatory in state schools since 2007, and it really just breaks it into that green, amber and red. So school tuck shops should be mostly green foods. They'll have some amber foods, and they have very limited red or occasional foods. Now those red or occasional foods are only there really, I suppose, on major events. So as I've got written there, it should be limited to no more than 2 occasions per term. So it might be at a sports carnival, you might have some red foods available, for example. That there is the general poster that we have to support that, and that can provide education in terms of, you might have that sort of up on the tuck shop wall to help the staff, because often the staff at a school tuck shop are, one maybe paid person and everyone else is volunteers. So this helps to inform all of the volunteers and that staff of what's appropriate and what's not. So how does it apply to schools? We've got the Food Act 2006 still applies at schools, as well as outside school hours care, and of course the Food Production Act as well applies in primary and high schools. So briefly around food labelling requirements, and I'm not going to read this whole thing because I think you'll probably have discussed this throughout the semester already, but all food must be labelled according to FSAN. So there are some examples some exceptions, and those exceptions apply whether it be at school or in a hospital environment. So if it's unpackaged, it doesn't need to be labelled. If it's made and packaged on the premises which they're sold, it doesn't necessarily have to be labelled. So a school tuck shop might make a Vegemite sandwich. It doesn't require a label in that particular instance. However, if there are allergens in that product, then you must know that it's there. So if a child comes up to the school tuck shop and says, I'm allergic to peanuts, I need to make sure that whatever I consume doesn't have peanuts in it, then the manager of the tuck shop should know. You can't really expect the volunteers to know, but the manager should know what does and does not contain peanuts, and the volunteers should know to refer to the manager. Okay. There's a list there of other exemptions as well that I will let you go through yourself. So this is so moving into boarding school food service, I suppose. That's just an image there of St Hilda's down here on the Gold Coast. So what about them? So in boarding houses, the students live as residents in the boarding school and receive the majority of their daily food and drink from those facilities. So they may also buy food from the canteen. They may have pocket money from their parents or whatever to go and buy alternate food. However, generally speaking, all of their food should be able to be provided through the boarding school. And believe it or not, there's no specific requirements for boarding schools. So while it should be consistent with the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, it's not actually required, and Smart Choices technically doesn't apply within the boarding school either. However, certainly as a dietitian going in, if you were employed to go into the Southport School or St Hilda's or any boarding school and you were doing a menu assessment, you would certainly want to do a qualitative comparison between what they're providing and the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, and you would also want to make sure that the protein and energy that they are being provided meets the students' requirements, because particularly in high school, these students will have quite high energy requirements if they're participating in sport, sometimes multiple times a day. Some of these kids will be doing before and after school sport, and then we'll have PE, and then we'll run around all lunch hour. So they might be getting 4 or 5 hours of activity every single day. And the boarding school has to provide enough energy and protein to meet their needs. So that's what a boarding school dining room might look like. So the students would sit around the tables, and then it might be a self-service sort of a situation where they can go up and they can select the foods that they want from almost like a banquet type of a thing. So it's a self-service environment. So they should be able to get adequate amounts of, I suppose, energy and protein compared to what I was saying on the last slide. But I guess schools need to make sure that it's not limited, so that the amount of energy coming in is enough to meet the requirements of all of the students. If the total energy and protein that they actually put out for service is less than what the total energy and protein requirements would be from all of the children in the boarding school, then obviously the school is not providing enough. So it's not even just a matter of measuring, individual requirements. It's about measuring total provision versus total requirements of all of the students. So the boarding school production distribution system. So production, it might be outsourced by a private provider, or it might be made in-house, and it might be a combination of both. So some foods might be made in-house and some will be outsourced. At the school I went to, it had a boarding school, and it did in-house food. They made everything in-house, and they also made things in-house in terms of any catering that was provided within the school. The boarding house made and provided that food. So there might be ways of the boarding house ensuring that they have enough budget to provide decent food by the boarding house would then charge, I suppose, a different department, and that money would transfer from one department to another department to ensure that the boarding house had enough money to provide food for the children. So that's sort of how that situation worked, but different schools will work different ways. Distribution, as I said, is that self-serve dining room. And the role of the dietitian in this sort of environment might be menu planning and assessment, staff training, training the volunteers, assisting with interpretation of guidelines. So you've got Nutrition Australia also provide information here, the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating, cooks and volunteers and so on might not know what's sort of healthier compared to not. They might be really strict on the other hand, so they might have this ideal view of what food should look like and what we should be providing to students, but they need to be trained to, you need to be a little bit flexible. Kids don't necessarily want to eat, vegan or, whatever health fad that particular person is going through. So making sure, I suppose, that, it's a reasonable food provision in a boarding school, and that there isn't someone getting overly concerned about the food that's being delivered, which does happen, to be fair. So non-boarding school food services, that's your canteens and your tuck shops. So as I said, you're going to have one sort of paid person and the rest would be volunteers. Production, again, some of it will be bought in, some of it will be prepared on site. So all your sandwiches, rolls and so on will be prepared on site, but then you'll have like pizza pockets and whatever else that will be bought in and just heated on the premises. Distribution is counter service, so students will walk up and they'll order, or they may pre-order as well. So you might be able to go into the tuck shop in the morning and order your lasagna for lunch or something, and you'll put the money into the little brown paper bag and you'll get your lasagna back at lunchtime all heated and nice, and that helps the school to sort of predict what they're going to be selling that day. The role of the dietitian will be to compare the menu against Smart Choices. So there is a Queensland Association of School Tuck Shops that employs dietitians to actually go and help schools to meet better choices, to meet the Smart Choices program. So it's not, a lot of schools aren't 100% compliant at this stage, but they're just trying to get schools to be more compliant. Some schools have gone completely over the top and they cook everything in-house, and they have like homemade, like there's this one school who the convener is actually, I think they're Indian, so they have these beautiful Indian dishes at every single lunch, as well as non-Indian dishes, but every single meal they have these beautiful dishes that are available to the students. So that's the kind of thing that you can expect, the range that you can expect. So that brings us to the end of this particular lecture. If you have any questions, please put it into the discussion board that's here. Please answer the questions that I have linked below, and I hope you enjoyed the module. Thank you.